Welcome to It's a Woman's World, a show which discusses any and all topics under the sun from a woman's point of view. Our program believes that women should be treated with respect at all times and in all places. Here's our moderator, Dr. Susan Strauss.
Greetings and welcome to It's a Woman's World, where, as usual, we've got a fascinating program for you today. But before we begin, and before I introduce you to our very interesting guest, I'm going to have each of the co-hosts introduce themselves. We'll start with Barbara.
Thank you. Barbara Lavalore is my name, and I am delighted to be here today. Thank you.
We're glad to have you.
Thank you.
And I am Jamela Pettiford. I'm also glad to be here. Yes.
And we are glad to have her. And tell us what you just had the honor to do and the privilege.
Yes, on Martin Luther King Day, I was asked by the governor to sing at the Ordway. And I sung the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. What an honor. So I'm glad to be here. I'm also glad to celebrate the dream.
Well, and we're honored to have you. One of these days, we'll maybe have to have you sing that song on our show.
Absolutely.
Ali.
Hello, it's so good to be back and to see you all. I'm Aline Fani.
And we have with us today our very special guest, Marisa Gonzales Morseth. And she's got a fascinating background to her.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here.
As a photojournalist, I'm fascinated by what you're about to talk about today, and I'd love to know what had you get started in this, and just explain a little bit about what it is that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, well, my background professionally has been working in museum exhibits and doing archival research and that sort of thing, but I've actually been collecting photographs since I was a kid. And recently I kind of got into doing research into the people that I saw in my photos. A lot of the time there's a name on the back or a location, like an address. And so what I kind of started doing was just doing research into my photographs. And sometimes I can take them back to the places where they were taken and kind of just juxtapose that. And yeah, I just like looking into them.
And just to clarify, these are old photos.
Yeah, old photos.
Not current type photos.
No, mostly black and white.
In black and white. Where do you find these?
All over the place, like estate sales, garage sales, antique stores, stuff like that. There's just so many out there.
And you find them, and what do you do? You've got the photo, and how do you research when it's just a blank photo?
Yeah, it's difficult. Most of the time when I do research, it's because there's some information on it. So I think it's less common now to print your photos and to write on them, but back in the day it seemed to be more common that people would label who was in the photo and where it was taken, that sort of thing. So if there is that information, then I can look into it. Yeah.
And I looked at some of your photos and I noticed that the landscape often has changed.
Yeah.
And is different, than what it was before. Is that also part of your research and your findings?
Yeah, sometimes, and sometimes that can make it difficult to figure out where something was taken. There are plenty of photos I found that I haven't yet been able to figure out where it is, just because even if you can see something in the picture, it might look totally different now. Yeah.
And Marisa, what is there a story that you would share with us of something that surprised you, or?
So a couple of the photos I brought today belong to a woman named Polly Parker who lived in Minneapolis, and she was kind of the first person that I decided to look into. I just kind of started this adventure with researching my photos like last year. So she was the first person I decided to research, and I was so surprised when I was able to find out a lot about her. When you see a picture of someone you don't know, there's not much to it, but once you kind of find out a little bit about their life, it's kind of amazing. So even if it's just where she grew up and like the names of her family members, it's always kind of powerful to know that.
Where do you find this information?
So since I do have a background in archival research, I utilize sources like our state archives, which is at the Minnesota History Center. I also use online databases like genealogical sites, that sort of thing.
Do you have a plan to perhaps create a book out of your findings? I think it would be interesting, and I can imagine someone reading that book and seeing a photograph of someone they know. That would be so cool.
A lot of people have brought that up. Like, I hadn't thought of that myself personally. Like, this has been kind of a selfish adventure, just delving into things just for the fun of it. But quite a few people have brought up the idea of doing a book. I'm not opposed to it, but no plans yet.
And it looks as though, now Ms. Parker, was this like in the 20s? What year was, a lot of these pictures that you're finding?
The ones I brought today are kind of spanning probably the 1940s to the 80s, something like that. Polly Parker's photos were mainly from like the 30s and the 40s when she was a young woman, maybe in her 20s or 30s. Yeah.
And now, so in some of these stories, do you create the storyline if you're unable to get maybe more of the detail of things? Because I'm sure you probably get some information, but then there's some information that's left undone. And I know for me, I like to fill in the blanks.
Right. As an amateur historian, I try not to, because that's my background, is to tell, what has happened, like the history of something. But you do have to make inferences into things when there isn't all that information. Like if you see multiple marriage records for the same couple, that's kind of an interesting thing I ran into recently, and I had to infer that they probably divorced and remarried, that sort of thing. But you can't know for sure. But sometimes I kind of have to assume.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in the Polly Parker photograph, I see that she's wearing a cowboy hat or a cowgirl hat, whatever, and she's with a dog, and you can see part of a car, which is helpful. You can kind of gauge the timing around because of the car. But the cowgirl hat, what was that about?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I'm really into fashion history too, and like I collect vintage clothing and jewelry and that sort of thing, so that helps me with dating the photos a lot, especially when there are women in the photos. I don't know why she's wearing a cowboy hat, but it seems like in the 1950s, Western-themed things, TV shows and media, that sort of thing, were very popular. So I'm going to go ahead and assume she's dressed somewhat Western because it was trendy. But yeah, I wondered that too, actually.
I think I remember that as a little girl. I was just a little girl, and like Hopalong Cassidy and the Lone Ranger and Gene Autry and some of those
Cowboys
people.
and Indians.
Yeah, Cowboys
Calamity
and Indians.
Jane.
Yeah.
And who?
Calamity Jane.
Yes, right.
That
So
is one of
maybe
the more
that's
fun
it.
things about looking at the photos, is seeing the fashion choices, because sometimes they make sense and other times you kind of have to like look for the context, what was going on.
You'd mentioned 1940 was kind of the furthest back that you typically go. Have you gone further, like into the 1800s at all? And if so, what did you find?
Yeah, I have a little bit. It's harder because cameras really only became accessible to most middle-class people around the turn of the century, and for many people even farther into like maybe mid-century of the 1900s.
Yeah.
So you start to see a lot more family photos once you get into the early 1900s. But most of what I collect is a little later on, I think, because so many families took so many pictures, it became a lot more affordable.
So for people who might wonder, well, why is this important? Like when we think of research or we think of history, what would you say the relevance is?
Well, I think personally for me, it's powerful to me to feel that not anyone is forgotten. You know, the way I end up with these photos is someone's family didn't want them, or they outlived all of their family. It's usually not a good situation. It's not often that people lose their family photos. So to me, it's kind of powerful to take someone who has been forgotten and then find out a little bit more about them. And just by sharing that, I feel like I'm doing them a little bit of a service.
So have you ever found or even looked for any relatives of some of the people that you've found in the photos? And if so, what did you do about it?
Yeah, I have. I only once now have found a relative and then returned a photo to them. And then even then it was not a close relative. She was married into the family of this individual in the photograph. I try, it's difficult, and a lot of the time I am able to confirm that the way I ended up with it is probably that either that person had no children and then the photos were sold at their estate sale, or other situations similar to that. But I'm always looking to do that in the future. I think that'd be fun.
How did that person respond when you provided them the photo?
You know, she was on an online genealogical site, so I think she was already interested in this sort of thing, so it didn't seem shocking to her, but she was maybe a little taken aback, like, who are you and why do you have my family's photo? Which